You're listening to Cloud 9, where BahaiTeachings.org interviews artists from around the globe to learn about what inspires, uplifts, and motivates them to make a positive contribution to the world. My name is Toloui-Wallace. Barbara Talley is a speaker, author, poet, and publisher who discovered the power of poetry at a young age. Since then, she has dedicated her life to social justice and activism. Barbara grew up curious about God and religion. In her interview with Cloud9, Barbara shares what it was like to be baptized in 3 different churches and almost joining the Nation of Islam. In her 20s, she encountered the Baha'i faith and was drawn to its teachings of oneness and nobility. In this interview, we learn more about Barbara's creative and spiritual journey and get to hear a few of her poems, offering insight into her vision for race unity. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us on Cloud 9.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
I'd like to learn a bit about where you grew up, and could you describe what your family home and childhood looked like? I think it's always interesting to kind of gain a bit of perspective before you kind of move on into the current life and how that's evolved over the years.
Wow, that's opening a can of worms. Well, I grew up I was born in upstate New York, and I lived there until my mid-20s, and then I moved to the Washington, D.C. area. My childhood was eventful. My mother died at the night before my 3rd birthday. So sometimes when people ask that question, it's like, whoa, it's much happier today. But just so that you understand, I guess it helped to understand the story, because it was in upstate New York before I moved to this area that I first heard about the Baha'i faith also. So I growing up in upstate New York around Seneca Falls, most people know where Seneca Falls is because that's where women's rights started, way back. These women that got together and decided that through their efforts, they're going to give people the right to have freedom. And then, of course, Black men got the right to vote, but women didn't until 1920. So it was another 50 years. But it was in that area that people were thinking about justice. And I didn't realize that. I was just a kid growing up. And my father did a lot of migrant work. And so we traveled from the north through the south, traveling with the seasons. We would live on those old, farms or plantations in those little dirt shack hovels, working from sunrise to sunset to make ends meet.
Did you have a lot of siblings?
Yes. Well, my father had 6 wives and 25 kids. All of them weren't together at the same time. But my immediate family with my mother, there were 6 of us. And but when my mother died when I was age 3, my older brother and sister, they were taken to an orphanage, and then we were put in foster care. So we kind of got separated, and then eventually we got back together. So that's kind of like my early life. My father, religious-wise, was not religious, but he was spiritual. He was born in Aiken, South Carolina in 1909. So he was a descendant of Native Americans and Irish people and African Americans. So he grew up mixed up because he was quite fair-skinned. And in South Carolina in 1909, and maybe today, there's the race issues. And so he kind of grew up mixed up. His family were church people. They were ministers. But he saw how they treated the darker skinned ones in the family. And so because of that, he kind of turned away from religion. So when we grew up, he told us, it sounds blasphemous, but he says, you can throw the Bible in the fire. You don't need a book. You can talk directly to God. So in some respects, I didn't grow up having to be a particular religion. But I grew up realizing that there was a higher power, there was a God, there was a creator, and that I had the power to be able to connect with that being, and I didn't need a middleman. So in some respects, and people used to knock on the door. We lived in many different places, as I said. We lived in Pennsylvania, in many different, different towns in Pennsylvania, and we lived in New York. in different towns. But my father, his story really impacted my story because he wasn't. If my friends didn't go to church, they didn't have a choice. The parents said, "You go to church." That's what it was like in the Black community. But in our family, it was like when the ladies would knock on the door and say, "Hey, Scotty, can those kids come to church?" And he says, "If they want to." It's really interesting. At a very early age, I had a choice to choose spirituality or not. I chose to go. I said, yes, I'd like to go. I'd like to know about God, because they said that when my mom died, they said she was with God. And the church says, hey, we teach you about God. I'm thinking, wow, maybe I can figure out how to get back to my mother. I think in some respects, I mean, I didn't understand it. And that was part of it. And part of it, I think, was the fact that there was a community in church. And that's one of the things that's so powerful about church, especially churches coming out of, post-enslavement America. When you know that in the South, many places after slavery, they weren't allowed to congregate together. 3 or 4 people together, they arrest you for vagrancy. The only places that it was okay to come together was the church. And so the church has a big, important place in the life of people of color. Probably most people, but more so for people of color. And I don't think people really understand the importance of community. As a Baha'i for all of these years, and I became a Baha'i I actually signed the card when I was 15 or 16 years old. The first time I went to a Baha'i thing in New York, there was kids that had pizza and roller skating. And they said, do you believe that there's one God? And I said, sure, I said, do you believe that there's only one human race and we should treat each other equally? And I'm like, yeah. They said, well, you sound like a Baha'i. I said, oh, okay. And they said, sign the card. And I'm like, okay.
And this is the first time that you'd ever heard about the faith?
The first time I heard about the faith, but I didn't know it was a religion.
Some club.
I thought it was a social club because it was all these years. It was pizza and roller skating. It wasn't at a church.
Awesome.
To me, the church domain, when you walk in a church, they're trying to teach you some religion.
You're not eating pizza and roller skating.
When you're eating pizza and roller skating, how was I supposed to make the connection? So I joined that, and I might have gone to a fireside. I have a vague memory of going to something at someone's house, and then I kind of left, And then I literally didn't become a Baha'i for 9 years. But I kept hearing about Baha'i here and there. People would say, oh, this is Baha'i. And I would say, Baha'i, I'm a Baha'i. No, girl, you ain't no Baha'i.
But I signed the card when I was 16.
I signed this card, and then I was thinking, is it B'nai B'rith or is it something different? I mean, after a while, I started wondering if I got it wrong, because I did not know about Baha'u'llah. I did not know about the Bab. I didn't know about the Universal House of Justice. I didn't know about Shoghi Effendi. I didn't know about local spiritual slings. I knew nothing. But in upstate New York, I met a Baha'i because I was actually going to a place where I wanted to do some radio work. Mm. And this guy who was doing the radio, I was auditioning to do some voiceover stuff. And he said, well, he was talking, somehow Baha'i came up. And I said, I'm a Baha'i. I didn't realize he was a Baha'i. And he said, and so we started talking because I knew nothing. You realize I didn't know anything.
You're just going around saying, I'm a Baha'i.
I just said I was a Baha'i. And they were like, girl, you ain't no Baha'i because you don't know nothing. I didn't even know it was a religion. I thought it was a club. So he said, he was a Baha'i. I said, oh, finally I met another Baha'i now that I'm grown. Tell me what a Baha'i is. And he said, you know what he told me? Now, this is many years ago, over 40 years ago. He told me it's too deep. You wouldn't get it.
No.
Said, yes, he did.
Oh, that's such a shame.
Well, and I said, well, what is it you guys believe? Or what is it? And then he said, I said, you have a book or something? Everybody's got a book. They got Bibles, they got Qurans. What's your book? And he said, well, there's a book called Thief in the Night. Mm. And I said, well, I want to get a book. And then he was saying the book was too deep. I said, well, let me be the judge of that. And so in my mind, I was like, nobody can tell me what I can be, which
maybe it was a trick question.
Probably a better
maybe it was
tactic because if
yeah. You proved
maybe
him
that
wrong.
was the way he was getting people. Maybe I proved him wrong that it was too deep, but So that was kind of. Then I started. I was doing modeling up in upstate New York, and one of my friends and I used to put on these fashion shows, and she started going to Baha'i firesides, and I said, she said, Barbara, you got to come to this. This is so amazing. She was just amazed. And she said, you have to come. And I said, I'll come to a fireside. And I never did go. But I kept saying I was going to come. But I kept saying, she said, then my job, which was at Eastman Kodak Company, moved me from Washington, D.C. Moved me from upstate New York, Rochester, to Washington, D.C. And she said, Barbara, you had promised me all of these years that you were going to go to a fireside. You never did. And now you're moving. I said, well, I know. I said, they got Baha'is everywhere. I used to get a newspaper or something. I never read it, but. And I promised her I would look up the Baha'is when I got to the Washington, D.C. area. And since I didn't know anybody, I did. And I thought to myself, it really says when the student is ready, the teacher appears. I don't know why I wasn't ready longer, because even before that, I got baptized different times in 3 different churches because I was seeking spirituality, but didn't know how to find it. I wanted something to happen. I almost like mystical and mysterious. I wanted like hear bells from heaven and angels singing or something. And when I got baptized, I still was the same person. I was like, oh, okay, I guess it didn't take, So then I got baptized. Then I decided that I was going to I met this woman in upstate New York, and she was a Muslim. She was a Black Muslim. And I thought, okay. And she prayed 5 times a day in her house. I was so impressed with it. Even more than that, there used to be this wino. Let's call him Wino Joe. He would be on the street. You know how you have these winos, people that are drunk, and you just kind of walk on the other side just to ignore them. Well, back then, there was this guy. You're familiar with the guy because you walk past him all the time, literally walk past. One day I walked past this guy, and the guy, they had cleaned him up. He was in a suit. He had a suit and a bow tie, and he was selling bean pies for the Nation of Islam. And I was like, that's that same guy. They pulled him up out of off the street. They cleaned him up. They prayed for him. They saved him. Now I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, now I want to be a Muslim. Because of all those years of being a Christian, we walked past people. It was all about individual salvation. Everybody else, the rapture, people going to hell. And, even though I'd always had this question, why are there so many religions? So I was open because I wasn't forced to be closed. My father didn't force me to be closed. Parents typically say it's this way or no way. And typically we stop thinking, we stop questioning, which is one of the principles of Baha'i faith, independent investigation of truth. I always had the opportunity to independently investigate truth.
Are you grateful to your dad for that?
I definitely am grateful to my dad for that. It's interesting that, my father, is it on one page 113? Let me see if I don't know why 113 comes to mind. But my father, he had a lot of spiritual things, even though I don't know that he knew of this faith. But my father used to put out these pink cards. And when we would travel in the South, he would give us a handful of cards and he would say, go out and pass these out to people. And the card, it was called the Truth Society. He literally, now we know that in the Baha'i faith, truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues. And Abdul-Baha, which is the son of the prophet of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, when he's asked, what is the purpose of life? Like, why are we here? And he said, to acquire virtues. But truthfulness is the foundation of all the virtues. And so my father, so this must be probably 50, 60 years ago, he would take his money and print out these little pink cards, and he would have us go around and pass them out to people. He would not let us accept any money. And this is what little pink cards, and the card says, "Dear God, please help me to try to understand the position I am placing myself in by taking this oath. I hereby take this oath before thee that I do not ever intend intentionally to tell a lie, and I will try to be friendly and respect everybody regardless of race, color, or creed."
And he wrote that?
My father wrote that. My father was also a poet, and he took the Lord's Prayer, and he says, "Our Father," and then he would say, "Whose Father are you talking about? Is he white or colored, or do you think that makes a difference with God? Who art in heaven?" He says, "If you were there, could you do any better? Here you use a Negro for a footstool and take advantage of his ignorance through your pride and arrogance. Hallowed be thy name." He says, "Here you call my mom and my grandmother by their first name, but even your children are to be Miss and Mrs. and to be politely spoken at every time." He took the Lord's Prayer and put a race and looked at it through the lens of race. It was profound. My father.
He was a visionary.
Yeah, I didn't understand as much of who he was growing up. It was like he'd go out in the hot sun and pass out these pink cards. But think about what he was saying. Dear God, please help me to try to understand the position I am placing myself in by taking this an oath before thee, that I do not ever intend intentionally to tell a lie. And I will try to be friendly and respect everybody, regardless of race, color, or creed. So you see, my father, even though he didn't take us to a specific church and belong to a certain religion, he was definitely a spiritual being that was enlightened, and he wanted justice. He wanted truth and he wanted justice. And I think that was instilled in me so much so when I saw this Muslim lady praying 5 times a day and actually looking at the results of what she had done by picking this guy up off the street, and they saved him before he looked dirty and whatever. And then he was, he had his humanity back. He stood proud in his suit with his bow tie. So I literally had decided then, now I'm going to become Muslim. You realize, even though I'd become Baha'i, I didn't realize it was a religion. So 9 years I'm going through this search. And so I go to the temple the day that we're going to go, and I decided I was going to become a Muslim. And she picked me up at my house. We rode together. And when we got out of the car, there were 2 males sitting in the front. We sat in the back. And when we get out, and so I do everything fast. I walk fast, talk fast. My stride is fast. So I'm walking a little fast. And she puts her arm out to me, like, slow down, let the men have some distance. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, she probably wants to say something to me she don't want them to hear. But no, I think that was like tradition. I'm like, uh-oh. Then I get to the temple, and I open the door, and all the women are sitting on one side, dressed in white, their heads in white thing on their head, and they're dressed in white, and the men are on the other side. And I said, do they have to dress like that? And she said, you'll learn. And I'm like, wait a minute, I think I'm being presumptuous here. I said, she said, no, come on in. So I literally got cold feet like a bride. And I said, no, I'll just catch a taxi back home. I'm sorry, I'm not ready for this. And that was kind of the end of that. Because equality of men and women is something that was something that deeply affected me. And I realized that had to be, I'm not a militant, but I'm a revolutionary. And I realized that women needed to be equal. And that just didn't make sense. Even though I didn't understand Islam, I didn't understand it, but I understood enough to know that this is something serious. These people are, and I need to do a little bit more research before I decide to become it, because I need to be it or not be it. Because in the Bible, as well as in the Baha'i faith, there are quotes that says, I wish that thou were hot or cold and not lukewarm, because so many people are just lukewarm. He says, I wish you were either hot, just be on fire with this, or cold, just say, look, I don't care. But all these people just sitting in the middle, that's the reason that we have the challenges that we have today.
So what was the step that you took to then declare as a Baha'i and become involved in the community life? And
well, what happened was I moved from my comfort zone area of Rochester, New York, where I knew people, to a place in Washington, D.C., where I didn't know anybody. And because I had promised my friend that I would look up the Baha'is, I called this woman, and her name happened to be Louise Love. She had a name like Love, And I tell her this call. I said, look, I've signed this card to be a Baha'i so many years ago, but I don't know what it is. Can you tell me what it is? 'Cause I need to be it or not be it. And she, of course, Baha'is live for calls like that, that they can share, share this.
She'd probably been praying for months for something like that.
Yeah, and here I was. She said, of course. And she happened to live near where I was. I had gotten an apartment. And so I just started going to these weekly firesides. And literally, just the main question I had was, why are there so many religions? And in explaining progressive revelation, it made sense. It was like, finally, somebody makes sense that God, it's not this or this or this when we're looking at Islam or Christianity or Judaism, or it's not this or this, it's this and this and this and this. It was just a little change of a word changed everything. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, then I started, it's like literally my mind opened up. I got that visceral experience that I was expecting. I literally felt like a new person. My mind, it was like I became this thirsty I don't know, like I was somebody in the desert. And every time I went to the Baha'i meetings, the information that they shared from Baha'u'llah that was for our day and age, it was everything I needed to be able to live in this world.
You
Now.
mentioned Thief in the Night. Did you ever read it and finish it?
Oh yeah.
Oh
Oh
yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah.
And was it too deep?
Well, here's what I think. I think maybe it could be deep, but I think when you really take a spiritual search, you arise to the occasion. You know, there's something called divine perception. There's many ways to learn, where we learn from, academic, or we learn from spirit, but I think in this case, it was divine perception, because I literally got smarter. I don't know if I was smart enough before it, but when you read the writings from this revelation, and you read the depth of it and the whatever it is, these words from God have a power. And I think we're all designed to be able to get it when we're ready. Perhaps I was not ready then. Maybe I was just more of a curious bystander rather than be a seeker. And you know that even in the Bible, it says that when you seek, when you knock, when you ask, but you have to be humble and you have to be ready. Many people are called, as they say, but few are chosen, because many people are not real. They approach spirituality, finding their God, finding out in a curiosity thing, and sometimes in an arrogant perspective, like prove something to me, as opposed to being a humble servant of the Creator of all there is, the great being, and then asking.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to get into your poetry now. I know at the age of 12, you wrote your first poem. And it was written in an act of protest towards your teacher, because she opposed to calling you Black. Could you elaborate more on the story and perhaps share this poem if you still remember it?
Yeah. Very interesting, because as I said, my father wrote stuff. He was a writer. In between us doing migrant work, and he had a fish market. So basically he wasn't earning livelihood by his calling either, but he would do that for service. But I was in upstate New York in school. And I remember there was a year that I think it was probably 68, 69, when James Brown came out with the song, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." Say it loud. My stepmom and dad, they wanted to be called Negro. When you call somebody Black, that was like insulting. You didn't want to be Black. People were putting on bleaching cream so that they weren't Black. So to be able to own the word Black. So I remember in my, where I grew up in upstate New York, there was only about 5 or 6 families that lived there year round. And then there would be families that would come in for the harvesting, for the migrant work, because there's strawberries and apples and all of that in the Mott's and Seneca, applesauce, all that business is up there. So a lot of migrant workers would come from the South up here to do that work. And so from September maybe to the first frost, maybe December, you would have lots of Blacks in the school. Whenever they would talk about Black History Month, all of us Blacks would just slink in our chair, because they would show a picture of Aunt Jemima. She was like a slave. She's like a cook. She's subservient. But anyway, a bunch of us decided that we did not want them calling us colored. We didn't want them to call us Negro. We decided that we were going to own the word Black. And so in school, we took these little we cut out a little circle and put a little safety pin. Back then, everybody had safety pins. And we said, "Call me Black." And I remember my teacher at the time, and we would come to school. We all agreed that this is our own, social movement in high school. And we put on the little sign saying we're Black. And I remember my teacher was saying, "Barbara, you're not Black, you're brown. My shoe is brown. And why are you doing that?" Because it was some kind of solidarity. It was something about us deciding what we wanted to be. And so each day we would do it. She would just shake her head. And then after a while, they sent me to the office. And at the office, you had to meet the Board of Education, which is actually a physical board with holes drilled in it. And they would swat you. They hit us a few times just because we wanted to be called Black. And so after the first frost, they kind of left us alone and me alone until when there were a lot of Blacks. But when they left and it was just 2 or 3 of us standing there with it, they said, okay, my teacher said, "Now, Barbara, enough of that nonsense." Nonsense, she called it. And I put the sign on the next day by myself. She sent me to the office. They swatted me a few times with the paddle. They had corporal punishment back then. They could hit you. And then I did that 2 or 3 times. And then he said, "I'm going to call your dad." Well, I didn't want him to call my dad, because my dad would have whipped me very badly. My dad He didn't give you a whipping. He gave you a whooping. That means he'll hit you with a switch or a extension cord or belt or whatever it is. So I would have really, we'll call it child abuse today, but back then they called it discipline. And so I decided that I would just not do that. So I started writing. I got angry. I'm like, I'm not bothering them. I'm not putting a pin on them. I'm just saying, call me Black. And basically they're saying, you have no rights. We'll call you what you want. So I went home, and this is one of the first poems that I remember. I used to write poems all the time, but this one I wrote to my English teacher because I got angry and I had no way of expressing myself. So I wrote this. I said, I was sitting in class when my teacher asked why I insisted on being called Black. With a puzzled frown, she said, you're more of a brown, so I schooled her in on the fact. Why, she asked, does colored oppose you and Negro and names like those? I said, well, it seems to me you're not too fond of being called any of the names we've chose. Actually, we are blacker than you are white because our color doesn't range. If we are Black, we stay that way, but your color changes. When you're embarrassed, you turn all red. When bruised, you turn all blue. So I ask you, why are you called white when colored would more suit you? When you're sick, you're yellow and pale. When scared, you turn all white. And your normal color is more of a pink. Are you sure that you were named right? Yes, we are Black, and we are proud, and we want our heritage to show. So we use this name without any shame to let all you quote unquote white people know.
Wow. How old were you when you wrote that?
12. So.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. Because basically back then our high school went from 6 to 12. We didn't break it up in middle school back then. But anyway,
you were angry.
I was angry and I had no other outlets, so I just wrote something down. So
you shared that? Did you share that with anybody?
I brought it to school the next day, and I went up and I handed it to my teacher, one of those teachers that had her little glasses on her nose. Yes. And I said, she says, what? And I said, I wrote something. And she read it, and I didn't know if I'd get in trouble and get sent to the office. But at the end of it, she said, she took off her glasses and she just looked at me and she said, you put a lot of thought in this. And I was very humble at that point. Yes, ma'am, because I didn't want to get sent to the office and get another whooping. But she says, wow, I get it. Okay, I'll call you Black.
So you immediately learned the impact of poetry.
I immediately learned, because what I found is wearing the pin and us Blacks, marching and don't mess, whatever. People didn't see us. They tuned us out. But when I wrote those words, and she being an English teacher, I mean, if it had been math or science, I probably would have still been limping today, because maybe they sent me to the office again. But because she was an English teacher, she understood it. And she said, I'm going to put this in the school paper. And so I realized then that maybe it's not through the anger, and maybe it's not through the force that I could change minds and hearts. Perhaps by a few chosen rhyming words, I could get people to think. Baha'u'llah says that poetry moves the hearts more deeply than prose. I didn't know that at the time, but he was equipping me with a skill to be able to take all that rumbling inside and be able to express it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to look at it. So fast forward a few years later, you came across an African priestess that had some news for you that was quite shocking. Am I right?
Oh, yes. So we fast forward, I've written a bunch of books. I've been a Baha'i for many years, and being involved in, all of the Baha'i stuff, the teacher, the community outreach stuff, became a tutor for the Ruhi. And of course, Ruhi is a series of lessons that we can sit down and study the divine word together in a very intimate atmosphere and get to know each other, because the word of God has the power to transform us. So fast forwarding through that, I'd written a bunch of books like On Track, On Fire, On Purpose, an inspired system for using your vision, values, and virtues. I'd written a book called Minor Miracles that was poetry, which says and minor was M-I-N-E-R, not M-I-N-O-R, like mine, because I was very inspired by this verse from Baha'u'llah that says, regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Rich in gems. If we looked at each other, not by our color, our class, our age, or whatever but we looked at each other as a mine. And with a mine, you just got to dig for it. Unfortunately, so many people dig for dirt instead of diamonds. But anyway, I'd written a few books, and I was having a book signing, and this lady came up to me at my friend's house, and she says, you are not a poet and an author. And I was thinking, boy, that's kind of rude.
Who are you?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, she sat there like she was somebody. She was had an African garb on, and she sat there and she said, "I'm an African priestess." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." I don't know about this. And she says, "You are not an author. She said, "You think you're an author. You think you're a poet, but you are a griot." Now, I didn't know what that was. She could have been cussing me out, but I was like, okay. Went home and looked it up. Back then we didn't have our smartphones where I could just say, "Hey, Google, what's a griot?"
Siri.
Yeah. But then you have to
griot.
Yeah, you got to go home and look at a dictionary and go find what that was. And griot was an African storyteller. And she says, with all of your poetry, you're telling stories. And I thought, wow, because we know that being separated from Africa, there's a lot about who we are that we've lost track of. But fortunately now with DNA and 123andMe and Ancestry, we can figure out some places where we came from.
It's almost like your dad was also a griot, and he channeled this to his children.
Yes. And that's why I'm a poet and Radiance is a poet. So I'm always
you're passing this down to your ancestors, and you didn't even know that there's an origin here. Yeah,
I didn't even know that, but I'm very excited to one day, in my future, to be able to go to the countries in Africa where I come from.
It's West Africa, right?
Yeah.
Can you describe what it is? It's storytelling, but there's there like a rhythm to it, or kind of language or metaphors that you use?
Well, here's the thing. She told me I was a griot after I'd written, a few hundred poems. And so, so even though I know that there's such a thing as a griot, I took that as messages from the ancestors that this is something I need to research. But quite frankly, I haven't even really done a lot of research on it. I looked it up at the time. It says storytelling. And it's interesting that most of my poems are all rhyming and they all tell a story. They're not, they're not abstract. For example, that one poem I just told you there. About that, you see that we were sitting in class, my teacher, so it's like telling a story with the rhythm in it, but there's also that piece of social activism, but it's also much of the things that I write about are about real things. So like one of my signature poems is called "Finding the Jewels Within You." Now, much of what I do in life, as well as what I write about, is all influenced by these wonderful teachings from the Baha'i faith. I mean, you think I grew up thinking that the first job I went to go to, they told me in that little small town in New York that they didn't hire Black people. The first apartment I went to, they slammed the door. They didn't want to rent to me. I'm growing up with a lot of racism, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. You just look at the, history, and you realize Dr. King's marching in 68 and people are putting hoses on him, dogs, and arresting him. So you think about if you grow up in an era and a time like that, the way we look at the world today was totally different. We didn't know that we had value. When I read the quote that really just, the words of God that really transformed me, it says, "Noble, I created thee." I had grown up thinking I was a sinner. It had to do with Eve and the apple and all that stuff. And we're sinners. But to say, "Noble, I created thee."
And these were the words of the prophet of the Baha'i faith.
Yes, the words of the prophet of Baha'u'llah, the prophet Baha'u'llah is telling me that you are noble, Barbara. You were created noble. It doesn't matter if somebody looks at you and sees the color. It doesn't matter if somebody looks at you and sees your gender as less. It doesn't matter that somebody looks at you and see your class as less. You were created noble. You were created.
Could you share this poem with us?
Yes, I'll share. Yeah, so this poem, it's called "Finding the Jewels Within You." All you need is one to believe in your dreams. That one can be anyone, or so to me it seemed. Just someone to spark your desire to dig inside. Someone you can trust. Someone in whom you can confide. There's gotta be someone who sees your light, who'll spur you on to win your fight. There's gotta be someone who'll see you through. But in the end, that someone must ultimately be you. A parent, a counselor, a stranger, a friend, anyone with a word of encouragement to send. Have faith in yourself. Bring forth your own jewels. Belief in yourself is your most important fuel. I ought to do that. I ought to do this. Nothing results from I ought to. I wish without action will bring no spoils to light. You must channel your energy. You must work. You must fight. You must focus your attention on powerful thoughts. Collect a life full of I dids instead of I ought. Can't you see it? Your brilliant light within. And can't you feel the fire burning from your right and desire to win? Anyone can help you get started. Anyone can help you stay on track. But you must learn to drive your own train, or you'll continue to hold yourself back. I took my bag of tools. I studied all the rules. I enlisted help from supporters, and I dismissed ill wishers and fools. I started to dig though no jewels were visible. I continued to mine when I was tired and miserable, and I continued with any and everything that I saw, and sometimes with just my own two hands. The point is I continued to dig and dig until I was just too tired to sing. And then even some of my friends said I should just stop, that I was wasting my time, that there were no jewels to be found, and least of all mine, even well-meaning family trying to protect me from a disappointing end. And many relationships were lost because I had no time to spend on them. So when mining your own jewels, the ones you know are inside, be careful who you entrust. Be careful to whom you confide. I kept digging and hoping and praying and knowing. And finally one day, I noticed something was showing. I don't know when it happened. Perhaps when I began the quest, or when I finally put all my faith and trust in God and persevered without doubt or rest. You see, I'd reached my goals, my dreams, my gems, and there wasn't just one jewel, there were thousands of them. It wasn't over. It wasn't the end. Now there are new goals on the horizon. It's time to begin all over again. So I offer you this advice. In whatever you choose to do, you owe it to yourself to find the jewels that are inside of you.
Wow. Wow. I wish we could. I'm watching on video right now, and it was so beautifully dramatized with your body movements that I wish we could somehow capture this for this podcast. Thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing. You mentioned yourself as first and foremost a Baha'i who uses poetry to heal, educate, and create a historical narrative of the age that we live in. So can you elaborate on ways you work to heal and educate? I know that you're a facilitator. You offer many, many workshops, and you're an author and a speaker. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on your healing and educational process?
Yes. So yes, and I like what you say. It's healing. It heals me as I heal humanity.
Yeah, I felt healed after just watching and listening to you share that beautiful poem.
Wow. Well, thank you. Well, I one of the things that I started doing earlier on in the career, because we're told that the best of all men is he who earns a livelihood by his calling. Baha'u'llah, the words are so beautiful. The best of all men is he who earns a livelihood by his calling. He also says the best thing in my sight is justice. He talks about unity. Know why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. He also said, regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value, as I mentioned from that poem. So with all of these things circulating in my head, I had to figure out what kind of career can I have where I can bring these things together and teach others, encourage others, help people to understand their value and their worth. So as a motivational speaker with the books that I've mentioned, 12 Spiritual Habits. It initially was 12 Spiritual Habits, and now it's, the excitement of value-based living. Superwoman doesn't live here anymore. Minor Miracles, On Track, On Fire, and On Purpose.
These are titles of your books.
Yeah, titles of some
our listeners can find.
Yeah, so each of the books really talks. It takes one of these quotes and says, well, how do I manifest this? How do I mine for the jewels within? If you're told that regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value, that means nobody's worth less. Some people just, some diamonds might be on the surface, but if you really look at what a diamond has to go through to become a diamond. It's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of dirt. You don't just find diamonds on the surface. So it's the same. So the Baha'i faith, what I loved about it, it creates a community where you can come together and discover and explore your spiritual legacy, your spiritual heritage, your spiritual identity together. Because the world looks at us through material eyes. You're tall or short, pretty or not, whatever it is, they put you in a box and you're worth something or you're worth less. But in the Baha'i community, with these wonderful teachings, we get to study this. And so initially, 30 years ago, I it was actually, you probably wouldn't believe it, but I started off in IT. I was actually doing technology. I mean, literally took C programming.
That doesn't feel like your calling.
It didn't feel, that's what I'm saying. I wasn't in my calling. And then I found this quote, but I love technology because I love the logic of it, because the world didn't make sense. And, when you're trying to write a program, either you put in this is what comes out. That's what input output. Most people expect to get something out that you didn't put in, even in life. But I remember Nat Rutstein many years ago, one of the Baha'is, had something called the Baha'i Institute for Race. I mean, he had Institute for Healing of Racism. And being obedient, and in 1992 in that area, the race unity statement came out. And I'm doing technology, but I'm also being obedient about.
What's the statement?
The race unity statement? The 1992 race unity statement. It's a vision of race unity that was put out by the National Spiritual Assembly.
Of the Baha'is of the United States.
Of the Baha'is of the United States. And they took out full page ads in the paper. And
wow.
It's a wonderful document. And we were all just inspired by this vision. It started to inform my thoughts. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, how do I teach this oneness? And so Nat Rutstein had come out with a book about Baha'i healing racism. And so we started a group of, the Baha'i started an organization called the Baha'i Institute for Race Unity. We're talking about the late 1989. And so we started having a couple of events every single month. In fact, it says the vision of race unity, the most challenging issue. And that's really based on, Shoghi Effendi wrote a letter that became a book called The Advent of Divine Justice to the American Baha'i, saying, look, here's what you need to do to deal with the racism in America. And if you don't deal with the relationship between the black and the white, if you don't deal with it, blood will run in the streets. This was in 1938. So this vision of race unity was really kind of based on that, but it's a wonderful document that says, it's entirely human to fail if that which we hold most important, our dignity, is taken for granted. It's like that Muslim young man, there was a wino laying there, and people only saw the wine. They saw the dirt. They didn't see the diamond. And the Muslim brothers and sisters, they saw the diamond. So when we see the diamonds in each other, so I started off so after this race unity stuff, I started inviting speakers to come and talk about race unity at our monthly events. And eventually I met some people who were actually doing diversity training, and they're saying, Barbara, you ought to come do this because of all of the stuff you're talking about.
You're already doing it.
You're already doing it. I didn't know there was a job paying people to do that.
Yeah.
So I made the transition in the 90s to doing diversity training. Then that turned into diversity training, conflict resolution, sexual harassment. So I literally got into all of this stuff about justice, because Baha'u'llah said the best thing of all in my sight is justice. So I started doing that. And of course, as a mother with 6 trying to balance work, I started my own business in 1987, so I'm an entrepreneur. So I'm trying to run a business, trying to raise 6 kids, trying to do 2 Baha'i events a month, trying to do all of this stuff. So that's when I wrote a book called, Superwoman, or a poem called Superwoman Doesn't Live Here Anymore, because it was like, I can't do it all. I'm not Superwoman. I know I'm capable of doing anything, but I still can't do everything. And then so I started writing more and more poetry. And so it kind of comes out in my books. It comes out in just poetry itself.
You have a blog as well. So I've read that you have over 1,000 poems, and they live in books and blogs, and also you're a keynote speaker. So you have all these different avenues where you're offering
exactly
your talent.
And the great thing about it allows me to focus it, because I'm interested in so many things. I could be all out there, but the Baha'i teachings they guide me. They keep me focused. My stuff is about justice. It's about oneness. It's about love. It's about unity. It's about our connection to each other, and that we are our brother's keepers. It's about vision. It's about
Yeah.
values. It's about
I've also read like you do a lot about balancing work and family and
exactly.
coherence and women's issues,
Yeah.
personal empowerment,
Yeah.
diversity, as you've
Yeah. So
mentioned.
it morphs. It's like it's like
And where do you share these? Where do you share these workshops and facilitate these spaces?
lately I've been doing a lot of work with appreciative inquiry, change management stuff. And I've been working in places like correctional facilities, 911, other organizations, because these are people that are under a lot of stress. So I've just gotten some recent training in a technique called heart math. And heart math is about the connection between our heart and our brain. And things like appreciation and love and kindness, gratitude, it sends a coherent signal from the heart to the brain. You can actually measure it and see it on software equipment. But if you are angry and hate and frustrated and all that stuff, it makes a very jagged kind of thing, and it really lowers our ability to be able to have coherence with the brain and be conscious and aware and be able to think clearly and all that stuff. So as I say, I keep morphing and becoming more, and that's why I said there wasn't just one jewel, there were thousands of them, just as there were the poems. And so but a lot of it was around race, family, motivation, inspiration.
It sounds very personal. These are things that you're also experiencing in your own daily life.
Exactly.
And learning and sharing with others.
Exactly.
And on top of everything else, you're also in the BahaiTeachings.org Advisory Council for Race and Unity. Could you share a little bit about what that is?
So the Advisory Council, what we do there is because people are all over the page, all over the place with race, with their lack of knowledge and insensitivities. And, I've always learned if you're attacking or defending, you're not in the mood of learning. So sometimes when we come to that race conversation, people are attacking or they're defending. Well, I'm not racist, I'm this, or you don't mean any. So then they're not in the mood of learning. So people will want to write stuff for the Baha'i teachings, but sometimes the perspective or the lens they're from, they may offend people. So what the council is
unknowing, like unintentionally.
Most definitely unintentionally. Mm-hmm. They want to write from their experience, but they don't know that something they're saying might be offensive to a person of color. So our group is there to look over the articles that have to do with race before they get out. And we all there's I think five of us, and whenever there's an article, we all read the article, we all give our perspective, we all ask, we recommend changes, or we recommend you don't post this. You're going to make a whole bunch of Black people mad if you do, or maybe write it this way or something like that. So the whole purpose is that, and I have to, I really commend Payam for doing this and caring enough to say, I understand that I as a Persian don't know, maybe the white person who's writing that article doesn't know, but together, if we can have the conversation, we can both learn.
What are some articles that you have really appreciated the perspective?
You're asking me, having gone to bed at 6 a.m. to remember a specific article.
I'm just thinking of if there are people out there who want to write about an experience, and you've mentioned that there are some things that might offend people. What are some things, rather than focusing on the negative, what are some perspectives or that you would appreciate hearing that you think we could hear more of in spaces in media and on the web?
Okay, two things. One is that if you tell your story, that's not offensive, especially when you're saying, this is who I am, this is how I grew up, but my hope is that I become more prejudice-free. If you just admit where you are, but what really gets challenging for people of color is people that learn a little bit of information and they try to put it out like they know it all, when obviously, I want to know your story. Tell me your story. I can't argue with your story. Your story is your story. I mean, just like I grew up in a Black house, some people grew up in a white house.
That's subjective. It's relative.
Yeah. So I'm not going to argue with your story. And I'm even more impressed if you have a story you're saying, but I know that this story, this acculturation that I grew up into, this environment I grew into, this is not who I want to be. And this is my journey towards oneness. I love stories like that. But when people try to tell people you shouldn't do this, and Black people need to realize, and one of the big things we get a lot of is we need to get over slavery. It's back in the past. There's no discrimination, and
they haven't lived that truth.
Or even yes, or even then they want to just throw out a lot of Baha'i quotes, or let's be one and let's not focus on it, as if focusing on it is the reason why we have all the issue. So things that say, I think a lot of times people want to, if they're trying to convince us not to be upset and things are going to be okay and whatever it is, rather than tell me what you're doing to make it okay. I don't care. I have access to many of the writings, so I don't need people to throw a lot of quotes at me. What I want to know is, how do these writings transform your life? What do they do to make you better? That story I'm interested in. But in that light, we are putting together, the council is putting together, as we speak, a guide for people who want to write about race, some guidelines, so that rather than put something out and then and not be accepted, but saying, look, here's the guidelines, that they must be grounded in the teachings, grounded in your experience, and so there'll be a list of those. We don't have that quite yet, but one of the things we've asked for, because we know that Baha'u'llah says guidance towards right action is far superior to punishment for wrong action. So we really want to guide people to the right action. And as we're saying,
and not to be afraid of trying to tackle this issue, but doing it in a very diplomatic and tactful, and respectful way. Yeah.
But you cannot lose if you here's another thing. There's 4 different kinds of stories you can talk about. Reality. You talk about the race reality. At the end of the race reality, if I'm on the bottom and you're on the top, unless you've told me you're going to do anything, you just ripped off a bandage and reminded me how things suck in my life. So if you're trying to say, and then sometimes when white people get woke or Persians get woke, they think, oh my God, I'm woke. And so they're telling us about this reality. They learned about how bad it is for Blacks and how they're paid less for this and how they get called back less and all the people that, if you only give me a woke conversation because you're waking up, all you've done, if you haven't done anything to change the justice, you've just kind of, ripped off my bandage to remind me how bad it is. So that's one of the things. If you're going to have a reality conversation, end it with what you're going to do. So there's reality conversations, there's equity conversations. Or let's go with equality next. Equality conversations are like, we get all the same thing. Well, if I'm dug down in a hole and you're up on a pedestal already, if we get the same equality from here on out, we're never going to have justice, right? Imagine somebody that's dug in a hole because we weren't allowed to have, our forefathers, a couple grandparents ago weren't allowed to read and write, weren't allowed to go to the same schools, weren't allowed to get paid the same. The redlining, couldn't live in the right neighborhoods. All of this stuff is dug by Black people down in the hole. If you look at the savings of Black people versus white people, it's abysmal. So even when we get old, it's like we still have to depend on people. We don't have the spoils of slavery to be passed down to us like most white Americans do, you see, and the vantage point of living in a society where you have institutionalized racism. So if you have a conversation about reality, you got to be careful about that, because unless you're gonna end it with, here's the reality, here's what I'm doing. I don't want to hear your reality. I don't need to know every time a white person wakes up, unless you're telling me wakes up. There's different levels of waking up. One is that, now I know what it's doing, but just to be waking up and sitting there and going, if you do something, I want to know about that. If you're going to do something to change this reality, then there's the equity conversation, there's the equality conversation, but the final conversation is justice. I want a justice conversation. If you're writing about justice, I'm all in.
I think what you mentioned is what are you doing about it? And there's so much in the Baha'i faith that gives us, there's so many tools that give us the power to actually contribute in this discourse, whether we're colored, whether we're mixed race or whatever. And I think I see the children's classes and the junior spiritual empowerment program, these conversations that are happening with the future voters and the future adults and the future leaders as very kind of empowering ways of being part of that discourse and that dialogue and the direct service in our communities.
Oh, yes. And that's what I love about the faith, because it's not about personal salvation. It's about salvation of humanity. I was just looking at some of the things with Widening Embrace that have you watched the Widening Embrace videos?
Yeah, so it's a new film that was released by the Universal House of Justice.
Yes.
About how these activities are taking place in and around the world.
That was so amazing, because in the Bible where it says the meek shall inherit the earth, they are inheriting the earth. People are coming into communities with these tools, these junior youth and children's classes and study circles, and
that address equity and justice.
Yes,
and
they're teaching people
education.
People that can't read find out, that now we can read because of this. Now we're starting our own schools. Now we're being able to be self-sufficient. So yes, I think people, one of the things that's so exciting is that we have the tools. We're trying to perfect a system to offer to the world in exchange for what they have right now.
I like how you said we're trying to perfect, because we're still
we're trying to perfect it. Yeah, we're not there yet. But we have a vision. We know that in the Bible it says without a vision the people perish. And this is why we see so many people perishing around the planet, because they have no vision. But we have a vision. We have a vision for racial unity. We have a vision for peace. We have a vision for justice. And so what Baha'is are just trying to do everywhere through these core activities, we call them core activities because, we have our firesides and we have our study circles and we have devotional meetings where we just come and pray, and everybody is welcome to bring any kind of prayer they want or no prayer, but just come. And in a spiritual environment, we love each other. We care about each other. The Universal House of Justice, which is our administrative guide these days, because in many religions, after the manifestation dies, the prophet, the religion gets splintered. But in the Baha'i faith, we were given a divine process to spiritualize the planet by the prophet himself. And so the Universal House of Justice, we elect people from around the world every 5 years by secret ballot, no electioneering, no balloting, to be able to look at what's going on in the world. And so, the Universal House of Justice, as you mentioned, put out that document or that video, a widening.
That's a document. Yeah. I see these films as much as they're videos, they're documents.
Oh, yeah. They're documenting the progress.
Reflection and process.
Oh, it was so uplifting to me, because it basically, you could see that the meek were inheriting the earth. And they said when they had their unit, they just had their election last month, that this is, they had people from, Africa. They said years ago in the beginning, many of the people were just Persian and white people who were on the Universal House of Justice. Now those 9 people from the Universal House of Justice represent countries. They're from their own country. They're from Latin America. They're from the Arabic nations. They're from Africa. They're from the United. So basically you have people coming together and saying, let's save our world together. I mean, to me, what's so profound about this is we just had a global election. A global election, when we have a hard time just having a country election, a state election, a local election.
Global democratic election.
That's huge. Huge. We're perfecting something. We're perfecting a process to hand over to the world one day to say, and we're doing it. I mean, 166 countries were represented. 1,300 representatives came together. Wow. So when you talk about what are we doing about it, the Baha'i faith offers so many avenues on what you can do. Any youth or child or an adult can do anything they want. If they feel that they don't have energy, they can just pray, Yes.
It's exciting. Yes. We all have the capacity to contribute and be a part of this discourse, especially when it comes to race. So you'd mentioned earlier, Baha'u'llah notes that poetry is more powerful than prose and it moves hearts more deeply. Could you share that poem that you'd mentioned earlier as a closing part of this podcast episode?
Sure. This one is called Love and Hate. And the story behind it, because it's griot style, even though I didn't know it. The story behind it is I had in my local area here, I'd gone out to a little area I had a babysitter who was Caucasian, and I went to her daughter's wedding, and the KKK happened to be walking down the street right by the firehouse where she was having her thing.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my. Wow.
So I caught in the middle of this, and I look very closely, and I see that under the sheets, under the robe, is a young kid. And I'm like, really kind of, I could not hate him back, because I'm thinking somebody taught this kid to hate. They taught him to hate. And what if my kid had grown up in an environment where they were taught to hate? We can't hate people because they have whatever they have right now. We got to love them back into humanity. And my daughter at her Montessori school was called the N-word. And then I was doing some diversity training for one of the government agencies. And a woman in my class said, if my mom were gay, I'd never speak to her again. So I looked in all of these three different things, that KKK young man walking, the hatred with a kid calling my daughter that, and this woman saying that she would never speak to her mother if she would. And I said, hate is just hate. So I wrote, I would, whenever I get all wired up.
That's your inspiration and motivation.
That's my inspiration.
That's a true artist.
Yes, it's like, okay, I got to.
You have to get riled up.
Yeah, you got to get riled up. And I said,
tense.
Yeah. And I was like, I got to get this out of me, this whatever it is. And so I wrote this piece called Love and Hate. On my way to heaven, we stopped and took a detour through hell. From a distance, things looked pretty okay. I needed a closer look to tell. A feast, great food and decorations, the finest delicacies ever cooked. All ages of gender and race and capacity were everywhere I looked. It appears that they have everything. So how can this be hell? My guide just smiled knowingly and said, look closer. Can't you tell? And then it struck me. They were not eating. They were looking starved and lean. And it appears they had no control over the seating. I asked, explain to me, what does all this mean? Oh, I've got it. They can't bend their arms. Look more carefully, said my guide. The spoons to which each has been given is long enough to feed the person on the other side. But why in all cases are they seated across and dependent on the person they hate the most? He said the intensity of the hatred has bonded them. They're stuck together now, said my host. You see, life was and is a workshop. From each situation, there's a lesson to discern. But the greatest is understanding the power of love and hate. That was the basic lesson that each was to learn. A black sat across from a white person who was fuming. I won't feed him, I am white. I'd rather starve than feed a black. To sit at the same table itself isn't right. And the black glared hatefully at the white. All whites are devils and racists. I would rather die myself than help even one white subsist. Well, it's beneath me to feed a thin beggar in rags, said the rich who sat across from the poor, while the poor gazed loathingly at the plump rich and said, from me you won't get any more. The one with a cross wouldn't feed the sinner. You're not worthy because you can't see. You're not, quote, one of the saved, so you'll never get fed by me. And the Muslim and the Jew hated each other. Both were still engaged in some earthly feud. Neither would feed the other. They just sat there staring at the food. Buddhists, Baha'is, and Baptists, all religionists, regardless their label. Whoever they had exalted themselves above during life, they found seated now across the same table. And the woman held contempt for man, because man said her role was for serving. Neither would feed the other, neither felt the other deserving. Throughout hell, I saw opposites attract, each couple bewildered and filled with dismay. No group was absent from this place. Did I mention the straight and the gay? Each hatred seemed greater than the one before. Which was worse, I can't rightly say, because after a while, hate is just hate. I don't think I'll ever forget that day. I asked to leave. It was too depressing. My sensitivity to hatred made me just want to cry. Is everyone who can't resolve their hatreds here, I asked? My guide said no, just those who wouldn't even try. Surprisingly, the setting in heaven was identical, except the bonds of love seemed to control the seating. And although everybody was happily talking when I arrived, each stopped and offered me a personal greeting. The heavenly figure approached me and said, heaven has a special place for you. Because while alive, you worked on your prejudices. Take a seat. You'll know what to do. Love begets love, and hate begets hate. What an interesting final accounting. Love or hate? The choice is yours. Just remember someone else may be counting. And you may end up with people just like you. And would that be the only fair thing to do? Think about your life now. Be honest with yourself, confide. Are there some changes that you can make while time is still on your side?
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful poem. Thank you for your service, your humility, your humanity, and your compassion. And really, truly, I'm so humbled that you offered your time today. So thank you so, so much. Thanks so much for listening to Cloud9. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to check out BahaiTeachings.org, where you can find more Baha'i-inspired podcasts, videos, and articles.